Welcome, everyone. Thanks for your patience as we get started. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to trickle in from the waiting room. Appreciate you all joining us for this virtual author visit, one of our virtual author series here with the Lincoln Public Library. And I think we've let everybody who is waiting in. Anybody else can join us as they get logged in here at 5 o'clock. And so I am delighted to invite Phuc Tran, who agreed to join us this evening, who is an author, a public speaker, a high school Latin teacher, a tattoo artist, a man of many, many talents, who's based out in Portland, Maine, and is joining us pretty late in the evening for him. So we really appreciate him being here. And is the author of the memoir Sigh, a Misfit's memoir of great books, punk rock, and the fight to fit in. Which won a number of awards, including the New England Book Award and the Maine Literary Award for Memoir, correct?
Yes, that's right. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
Fantastic. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kathryn. Thank you, Sam and Lincoln Public Library for having me. So I thought it might be helpful for your audience members to hear a little bit about where the book came from, and then I would read a little bit, and then maybe we can jump into a conversation.
I think that sounds fantastic.
Yeah. So I guess this is like my origin story, right? Like it's I wasn't bitten by a radioactive spider or exposed to gamma rays, but so I guess the question is where did this book come from? So I've taught high school Latin since 1997. I recently just went on hiatus, so I taught Latin for 22 years, and in that time I've also simultaneously been a working tattooer. So I've been tattooing. I started in New York City and then transitioned here to Maine. And so, of course, naturally, if you're a high school Latin teacher and a tattooer, the next thing you want to do is write a memoir. So I'm sure many of you are wondering, where did that come from? So it really started in 2012. So in 2012, I gave a TEDx talk and here in Maine. And as I was preparing for that TED talk, the speaking coach that was working with me, kept using this refrain. He kept saying, "This is the talk of your life. This is going to be the talk of your life. This is the talk of your life." And it was sort of like an institutional refrain. And I think they were using it just to scare us, and really put the fear of God into us and make sure that we did a good job when we got up onto that TED stage with like the red dot and like the earpiece. And but I took that refrain of "this is the talk of your life" very seriously and literally, because up to that point, I had never really talked about my experience publicly talked about my experience as a refugee, growing up bilingual, growing up in a small rural town in Pennsylvania. And I just thought, well, I guess if this is the talk of my life, I should just go for it. Like, I've had enough therapy now in my 30s. I feel like I'm relatively well adjusted. Like, there's not a lot of shame, hanging over me. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna do it. This is the talk of my life. I'm gonna talk about all the things that are important to me and that made me who I am. So for this TED talk, I'm gonna talk about the refugee experience and growing up bilingual and 80s pop culture and punk rock and grammar and John Hughes movies and Star Wars. I'm going to do that all in 12 minutes. What could possibly go wrong? And so I just thought, if the talk blew up in my face, so be it. At least I was ambitious. And when I gave the talk, it was, really well received. I was very surprised at the moment, like in the audience. And then it ended up being picked up by National Public Radio's TED Radio Hour. So then it got some national attention, which really surprised me. And then from there, in Portland, I started doing live storytelling. So once or twice a year, I would sign up here in Portland for these sort of like moth radio hour events. And I would craft like a 7-minute true to life story and then get up on stage and perform it. So I did that for about 4 years. And then in 2016, and I should say at that point, that was when I sort of had the idea like, maybe I'll write some of these stories down, because every time I got up on stage and told a story, like the reception was really positive. And so I thought, yeah, like maybe this is like a retirement project, like when I'm old, like I'm 80, like my hands don't work and I can just sort of like, and I can't tattoo anymore. I'll write a book maybe. And then in 2016, a literary agent from New York just like called me. She sent me an email and said, "Hey, I saw your TED Talk. It seems like you have an interesting story and an interesting way to tell it. Would you be interested in writing memoir?" And then I'll sort of just like make this long story a little bit shorter. So that's really how it started. So in 2016, I signed on with this literary agent, and then we worked on the book. And then in 2020, the book came out 1 month after the pandemic. So so that was great. And so now here we are in the Zoomiverse. Still talking about the book. So I thought, and if there are other questions from you, Kathryn, or from the audience about that process, I'm happy to talk about it more. But I thought I would just read 2 short selections from the book, and then we could jump into a conversation. Does that sound okay to you, Kathryn?
Absolutely. I think a reading's great. And then, we can have a chat about, the process of writing it as a memoir, how it came through, and some of the themes that you have in your work.
For sure. Yeah. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the opening of the prologue, and then I'll read a short selection from later in the book. I should mention also, for your audience, for those of you who haven't read the book, so I name each chapter of my book after a great work of literature that was profoundly influential on me as a young person. So like the opening of the prologue is called, A Picture of Dorian Gray, and like the subsequent chapters are called, Crime and Punishment, The Scarlet Letter, the Iliad, and so on and so forth. And I tell all of those chapters sort of vignettes through the lens of the book that I've chosen. So it's a sort of fun literary Easter egg, or egg hunt, I guess, if you want to call it that. Okay, so I'll read from the intro, which this intro just sort of describes my town, the town that I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. Nestled in the Susquehanna Valley town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Carlisle Senior High School sprawled as a monolithic mid-century modern block of types, archetypes, and stereotypes. Industrial gray lockers ringed its hallways, the compartments narrow enough to repel most of your textbooks, but wide enough to collect the trash and detritus from your backpack. It's your own personal landfill. Linoleum floors, classrooms with chables, the combo chair tables of the 70s, blackboards, American flags, loudspeakers from which the wah, wah, wah of adult speak would drone. Our school district was so large that the juniors and seniors had their own separate high school, the so-called senior high school, and the freshmen and sophomores had their own underclassmen high school building. Carlisle High School stocked its seats and bleachers with a familiar cast from the 80s, the athletes who towered above the rest of us, the cheerleaders who lay supine beneath them, the geeks with their physics books under their arms, the preps with their tree-torn swatches and impeccable Benetton sweaters. A handful of black kids with MC Hammer pants and tall square afros tightly faded, punks and skaters with their leather jackets and black Converse. A few swirly hippies, the rednecks with their oily palms and cigarettes and trucks. Carlisle High School was another cultural cul-de-sac built with the craftsman blueprint of John Hughes, the Frank Lloyd Wright of teen malaise. Overwhelmingly white, Carlisle's population offered all the rainbows of Caucasia. The town's main employers were Dickinson College, the Army War College, a smoky stack of factories, and the service industries that had sprung up to support the aforementioned trifecta. In the spirit of public education, we progeny were all in the mix together. The itinerant army brats, the ivory sons and daughters of professors, doctors, and lawyers, the greasy offspring of waiters, cooks, and factory workers, and the token refugee family. The Tran family blended right into the mix like proverbial flies in the ointment. That is to say, we didn't. Carlisle's glitter was unmistakably 80s, but its structure was straight from the post-war era, bricked together by the mortar of the 50s. We had a downtown Woolworths with a chrome luncheonette counter and red vinyl stools, and a grand movie theater with its incandescent marquee. The four corners of Carlisle's town square were righted by two courthouses and two churches, Episcopalian and Presbyterian. God and law and law and God. It wasn't a subtle message to any of us living in Carlisle what was at the heart of the town. And the pièce de résistance, our high school was the town's designated Cold War fallout shelter. The blue and yellow radiation placards festooned our hallways, reminding us that we were only a button push away from nuclear annihilation. From what I gleaned on television, Carlisle seemed like a slice of American pie a la mode. We bottled lightning bugs on summer nights. Trucks flew Confederate flags. We loitered at 7-Elevens and truck stops. We shopped at flea markets and shot pellet guns. My high school provided a daycare for girls who had gotten pregnant but were still attending classes. We stirred up marching band pride and fomented football rivalries. The auto shop kids rattled by in muscle cars and smoked in ashen cobbles before the first period bell. We were rural royalty. Dairy Queens and Burger Kings. So pause right there, and then I'm just going to read a short selection from the beginning of this chapter called "The Metamorphosis," which uses the lens book of Franz Kafka's short story novella, "The Metamorphosis." So I'll just read a very short piece from this. Franz Kafka's "The Metamorphosis" is a simple story. Gregor Samsa awakes to find himself transformed into a giant bug. When he discovers that he's a giant bug, he immediately looks at the clock and thinks about which train he can still catch to get to work on time. By himself, he's not freaking out about being a giant roach at all. His parents and sister, whom he's been supporting, freak out. His supervisor from work shows up and freaks out. Gregor has turned into a bug, but he does not freak out about his transformation until he has to navigate his relationships with his family and his work supervisor. You read The Metamorphosis and you realize it's his family's ugliness towards Gregor that moves the story. Gregor is now a giant roach, and he cannot do anything about it. His family, instead of acting with compassion and kindness, sends Gregor to his room and locks the door. What's worse than turning into a giant bug? Turning into a giant bug and having your family act like a bunch of assholes. And isn't that adolescence? A biological change over which we have no control. And then our family, like a bunch of assholes, treats us like an insect in the midst of a metamorphosis that we ourselves hardly understand. Suddenly, with a different focus, from the perspective of a bug, we see who they really are. So I'll stop there.
Oh, those are fantastic. Those are fantastic. Thanks. I did love your introduction to the metamorphosis when I was reading through your book, which is just so true that, he's worried about getting to work. Everybody else who's like, how are you going to do this as a giant roach? This seems problematic for your work.
Yeah.
And I think, too, both of those kind of highlight one of the things, if I can, I don't have a question at the end of this. This is just me talking about how much I enjoyed your book. So, but one of the things that I thought was really well done in your memoir is this, you're incredibly gifted at sharing pretty universal, particularly adolescent experiences and childhood experiences, while also then being able to show how the unique circumstances of your life, particularly in your community, but being a refugee, being a person of color in America, being from an immigrant family, raise the stakes and give that those community connections give very particular overtones to experiences that are pretty universal. I'm thinking to mention another incident that you describe in your book, your father mispronouncing Colonel. When I was reading that, the first thing came to mind is like, oh, I remember the first time I was in class and pronounced macabre with full pride about Edgar Allan Poe. And everyone went, macabre.
You're like, oh, yeah.
But then you layer this with the other experiences that you knew of your father with trying to pronounce English coming from speaking Vietnamese and the profound differences in sounds and pronunciation and how that played out, not as a now let's laugh about it childhood experience, but with a very real constant implications for how you and your family were treated in Pennsylvania growing up. And I thought that that was a really powerful structure that I saw repeating over and over again.
No, thanks. I really appreciate your that observation. It's not one in the in the thousands of Zooms that I've done. I don't think anyone's really articulated it that way. So I really appreciate that. I think I think it was a gift to be writing the book at the same time that I was parenting young kids, like, my age. My kids are now 8 and 11. I've been working on the book, from 2016 on, so at that time my kids were 3 and 5. So it was fascinating to think about what my relationship was with them and how my kids are constantly peppering me with questions about the world, about America, about current events. Like, I think they just want assurance, they want some sense of foundation and stability. And that starts from their parents, and that really, for me, like, fueled those early chapters where, I always felt like I felt frustrated that my parents couldn't navigate the world around us, and I didn't know why. And obviously, like, as a 5 or a 6-year-old, like, you don't understand sort of things like the refugee experience or institutionalized racism or any English as a second language or any of that. Like, you just are like, why can't you guys figure this out? Like, it was like I could see my parents struggling, and that just filled me with a lot of anxiety and dread, and being like, if they can't figure this out, like, I guess I got to do it myself, right? Like, that like punk rock DIY mentality started really early because, it felt like my parents, couldn't find the bathroom at like a store because they didn't know they were called restrooms. Like, they were like looking for signs that said like toilet or bathroom, right? They're like, oh no, it's called a restroom. They're like, what? Like, there's like, our culture is just like full of like those little funny shibboleths, right? And it takes people a long time to figure out that it's not macabre. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things I thought was interesting when you were kind of talking about your beginning process, that a lot of these kind of stories, or at least the framing of these experiences as stories, started with kind of live performance with the TED Talk, and then you talked about Moth Radio Hour. How different was that process than when you started coming back and thinking about it as a full book, as something to be read without that feedback and to be more than these kind of encapsulated short-term kind of bound by time experiences?
Yeah, that's I think I think like, my love of storytelling started with the written word and with stories and sort of long format books. So really, like, I think like crafting like 7-minute Moth style stories was really hard, but it also, I think, really forced me to be efficient, right? Like, it sort of forced me to strip a story down to like its bare essentials, and also to sort of like, sort of craft a narrative that was sort of immediately very like hooky, and that pressure was always there. So frankly, like, I think being able to transition to a longer format, like a real book, with like real chapters, let me kind of relax a little bit and play and like, to sort of have fun with pacing and things like that. So I think, but I think like the Moth radio stuff, and then, or not, it's like live storytelling. It was never the Moth, but it was like live storytelling. I think in combination with like years of teaching and reading Latin, you and I know, like, Latin is like incredibly efficient, and so like that sort of built into my own writing and thinking about my writing like a kind of economy that I think maybe didn't allow me to sort of like spin off and like write a lot of like sort of fluffy sort of like frosty sentences, as it were.
Absolutely. And I agree. I think in your book, it really moves forward very kind of story and action driven. And I think sometimes in any style of writing, there's always the trap of falling into just, okay, let me explain everything now. And, show don't tell is much more engaging. And sorry, I just saw one of our questions come through.
Oh, yeah.
So with that and with language, because you mentioned Latin. So first I have to ask, because you've been a Latin teacher, how many languages are you proficient in?
Well, let's see, define proficient. I mean,
I don't say fluent, because fluent's very, have a lot of weight on which it is, but you haven't just taught Latin, you've taught other languages as well.
For sure. Yeah, so I grew up bilingual, speaking Vietnamese and English. I spoke Vietnamese first, but since then, I am functionally illiterate in Vietnamese, and because I didn't go to school, like my Vietnamese sort of like tops out like maybe like a second grade level, so like would I die in Vietnam if you dropped me there? No, definitely not. Like could get a hotel room and a meal, but like I couldn't discuss like the economy or cryptocurrency in Vietnamese. Like I have no idea what those, so it's like it's just like I'm like vocab deficient for sure. Like I don't actually even know any swear words, because like my parents just never taught them to me. So like I could totally get cursed out in Vietnam and just be like, well, I don't know, I guess that guy likes my haircut. I have no idea what he said. So English I'm pretty good at. And then I studied classical languages and literature in college. So at Bard. And so, we sort of we ran that gamut of like Latin, Greek. And then in our program, we also did Sanskrit. So I did Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. And then I thought I was going to go to grad school in Germany for classics. And so I did like a German intensive and studied in a semester abroad in Germany. So German ended up being my minor. So I mean, my German's actually, I think, pretty good. Like, it's probably, I would say, in terms of proficiency, like English and then Latin and then German and then maybe Vietnamese in there. And then like I've, as part of the diaspora, the Vietnamese diaspora, I have relatives in France. So my French is like, okay, again, I wouldn't die there. Like, can I get a baguette? Like, yes. Can I tell you my pencil is yellow? Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and I kind of wanted to ask that because one of the things, for anyone who hasn't seen your TED Talk is fantastic. It's grammar, identity, and the dark side of the subjunctive. Subjective, not subjunctive.
No, subjunctive. Yeah.
Oh, okay. My notes are wrong.
Yeah. No,
dark side of the subjunctive.
Yeah.
Which, I do want to say for anyone who hasn't seen it, if you ever want a summary of what the subjunctive is, if you're sitting there going, oh God, I know that came up in Spanish or French class back in the day. Fantastic introduction to it. But one of the things that you talk about is kind of how language influences the way that we see and think about ourselves and the world and our futures and how we can move through it. And one of the ththings I thought interesting in your book is I felt like you also kind of talked about the literary canon in a similar way, perhaps not as direct as grammatical forms. But you're laughing, you're saying that you and I, for anyone who doesn't know, I took Latin in college. I'm very bad at it. But Latin is very concise in a lot of ways. It can be very direct. Ancient Greek has a whole grammatical structure that doesn't exist in any living Western language, and good luck to all of us trying to translate out of it. There's different ways of viewing the world that are encoded in language. And so in your book, you use literary canon to structure it. And I'm kind of curious, you're multilingual, you have so many doorways into the world and describing and being able to see those limitations. And there's been a lot of conversation about, does our literary canon serve, given that a lot of it comes from kind of one cultural background, one perspective. So I'm curious, you're a teacher, what would you add to our canon to expand that conversation? Or what do you think about how do we handle the value of a canon as a language that people know to talk across centuries versus how do we express ideas and experiences that maybe aren't fully in the canon at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, like we build more seats at the table. Like I'm not a huge, I mean, I think this is controversial and, I'll just go on record, since this is being recorded. I don't think we need to get rid of books, but I think that like, as we evolve and as we learn about things and then also as our sort of cultural center or moral center or ethical center shifts, like we can keep reading the same books and have very different conversations about them, right? Like that a book that used to be sort of lionized as, sort of like the apogee of, literary accomplishment, we can still recognize its accomplishments, and we can also talk about its deficiencies, right? And sort of sort of inherited or sexist or racist tropes, or what have you. I mean, any number of sort of problematic things, and that's true for any era, right? So, but I don't think I don't want to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and but I think it is really important to at least offer kids that opportunity to see themselves reflected. There's this metaphor that English teachers use, or English language arts teachers use, about literature functioning as a window, a mirror, or a sliding door, right? That like kids can see into another experience, see their own experience reflected, or perhaps even pass through and, sort of like have an empathizing experience in reading a book. So I think at its best, like a book can do that. I mean, you present sort of a buffet of books to students in your ELA classes at the beginning of a semester or a school year, and they're going to read what, 10, 12, 20 books. And I mean, if they connect with one book in a deep and significant way, like that's all I could really hope for. And I think, for me, like all of the lens books in my book, with the exception of one, is like the dead white dude canon, right? And I'm offering that up because that was my experience. I offer that up without sort of explanation, but it certainly is an invitation for the readers to think about, oh wow, like why is it all like dead white guys? Like, is it a product of the time? Like, are there deficiencies there, or did Phuc really just sort of bypass that as much as he could, just to sort of connect to the deeper human experience of any great work of literature, which is what we want all students to do, right? I just thought, like, as a kid, I thought two things. One, I was never going to read a book by a Vietnamese person, right? So I just thought, well, I guess this is what's on the menu. I might as well just try to dig deep and connect with it. I mean, I really, really wanted a sense of connection and belonging as a kid. I didn't have that at home. Spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read the book, like, my family was dysfunctional on its best days and abusive and violent on its worst days. And my town was a complicated place. There were great people there, and there were really, sort of strident racists in my town as well. And so I just was looking for any kind of foothold or connection to anybody who could just see my humanity and my experience. And so for me, that was first in books. And the other thing I just want to say is that, I remember I never felt like sitting in the classroom that my white classmates, felt some kind of special connection to Charles Dickens or Mark Twain or Shakespeare just because they were white. Like it wasn't like, my friend Chad was like, well, that's Shakespeare, he's white and I'm white. I really connect with that guy. I mean, Shakespeare is like just as alien to Chad as he was to me. But I thought, I'm willing to read and work at, and excavate something out of that Shakespeare that maybe Chad wasn't willing to do or needed to do. Like I needed to do it, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I think that's I think that's a great point, that yes, Shakespeare, the distance in time and the distance in culture is very real beyond any conversations of race or gender and things. Shakespeare's experience was different than any of us alive today in very real ways. And I think your point about different conversations, the last chapter in your book is the Iliad, and most of us don't read the Iliad today as an example of what honor and manliness and heroism should look like. We're mostly, not going into hand-to-hand combat and saying, yes, this is the end all be all of how we value. But, you do mention in your book that, all great literature ends up touching on great themes, regardless where it comes from, and themes of belonging and identity and community and how we interact in that. And yes, I think that's shocking. I'm a librarian. I also think books are great for that and that ability. But I thought that was very well said in your book, this idea that the canon is a conversation that we can all be a part of, and the great works do touch on themes. But yes, I'm all for, what conversations can we have around them and how can we do that?
For sure, yeah, and I think like I would never call it my superpower. It was just sort of like my yeah, I don't know, my it was just sort of the way that I approached every book, as a teenager. Like, it was really in my immaturity. Any book that I read, I would just crack it open and be like, okay, what's this book? What does this book have for me? Like, literally, what's this book going to do for me? And like, I would often just read like 3 or 4 pages, maybe a chapter. Like, I remember, reading like The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner and just being like, ugh, like, next, like, I mean, it was just like, it was just basically like the Tinder version of like reading. I would read like I'd be like, nope, swipe. And then, but like when I read a book like that really blew my hair back, I was like, whoa, this is like, oh, okay, all right, I'm gonna keep reading, So it was deeply immature. Like, I like knew nothing about the author. I didn't know who William Faulkner was. I was just like, okay, is this book gonna grab me or not? And then if it didn't, I would just move on and read another book.
Oh, that's fantastic. I remember doing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just going through and finding it. So your book is currently structured around different books that are meaningful to you, but you also talk a lot about the importance of music in your life and punk rock. And so maybe as a thought experiment, if you had restructured this based on music albums, what would one of those have been?
Oh boy. Oh, absolutely. Oh, I love this question. I would definitely pick The Clash as, like, absolutely. I mean, they're one of my favorite bands. I think still, as a middle-aged man, like, highly listenable for me. But I think my favorite thing about The Clash in particular, and I could pick probably either London Calling or Sandinista, is how The Clash like refused to sort of be put into a box. Like, as soon as like they came out in 77, by the second year or the third year of like the punk movement, like, they realized that they were painting themselves into a corner, like, sonically, right? Like, the punk rock trope was like just really like, it was like 3 chords and the truth, and they're like, no, wait, like, we want to play all sorts of things. We want to play rockabilly, we want to play reggae, we want to play disco. I mean, and so like each subsequent album, they were constantly sort of changing their sound, and alienating old fans, but also, broadening the tent, broadening that umbrella, the definition of what could be punk, which I just love. Like, I think The Clash just refused to be categorized. And I think that speaks to me still to this day. I mean, it really has the DNA of Walt Whitman's, I contain multitudes, right? When he says, like, I'm a parrot, I contradict myself, so I contradict myself. I mean, that is inherently so deeply human. And I think The Clash, did it. So I think like they share really amazing sort of, there's a Venn diagram there between Walt Whitman and The Clash that I think is really great.
And that's my new favorite. I'm going to go read Walt Whitman while The Clash is playing.
Yeah, for sure.
But I do think that's really interesting. So I also think that's one of those tensions with kind of punk rock and punk rock culture, which is so much about punk is defying categorization. And yet, you talk about this, especially when you're an adolescent, you're falling into that, the demarcation of, well, okay, so who and what is really punk and who or what is posing? And how do we do that? And that's kind of antithetical. And so I agree. I think The Clash do a really cool thing in staying kind of true to what they're interested in and pushing back against that, like, okay, we're all going to just fit into what our genre is and what we're doing and what our project is. So brilliant.
Yeah.
So.
No, thanks. Yeah. And I think culturally, and I think individually, I think like we fixate, or we ask this question about authenticity when our nation, or when we as individuals are in crisis, or when we're at a sort of a crisis or inflection point. So that happens as a teenager, right? That's like a pretty powerful inflection point in your life. And so you're asking, like, well, who's a real fill in the blank, right? Who's a real punk? Like, who's a real American, right? Who's a real, whatever. And then so I think, and I'm not sure, I bristle at that question, because I think there's this implication that like people can be fake, which is not, like, that's not a thing. Like, you are who you are. And I think that question about authenticity also immediately short circuits this idea about being aspirational. Like, maybe I'm not who I am now, but I want to be somebody better than who I am today, right? And that doesn't speak to authenticity, right? Or maybe it does. I don't, like I think it's just the idea of like saying that somebody is fake or a poser. Like I never enjoyed that conversation, and even to this day, I find it highly problematic, because now we're talking about it on a national level, right? Like who's a real American, right? Who's who really gets to vote? All that stuff. It's just like, what are we even talking about? It's just so strange. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point with the idea that it kind of flattens the conversation, that, like you're saying, like aspirational, how do we leave room for growth and change if we're kind of doing this zero sum, yes or no binary? Where do you fall into? Because most of our lives are much more complicated than that.
For sure.
And if anyone's driven, please let me know how you got there, because
yeah. And I mean, I don't want to blame the internet. I mean, I think we've always been this way, but I mean, the internet does not make it doesn't it generally does not pave the way for complexity, right? Or complex conversations at all. But I mean, I think we've done this, time and again, sort of like flattening.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're coming up to Q&A real quick, and looking at the question that we've got in the Q&A right now, I want to ask you a couple questions kind of about the process of writing memoir. I know we talked about this a little bit with kind of live storytelling versus sitting down and writing down, but memoir and autobiography as a genre is in some ways a particularly difficult one, because your subject matter is your life and the lives of the people around you. And particularly, you mentioned briefly, and for anyone who hasn't read, your family has had great difficulties, and not everyone has acted in ways that might be considered the most flattering to display publicly. And I'm wondering a little bit of like, how do you balance telling your truth and knowing that, yours isn't the only truth that's going out there? Or is that a consideration? Is it that it's your truth and that's kind of the project?
Yeah, I think yes. I mean, adjacent to that question, someone asked once, they said, wow, are your parents dead? Because you write this memoir as if they're dead. And I was like, oh no, they're still alive. Like, I mean, did they enjoy the book? Not so much, but my dad, I just saw him recently, and someone asked him, they're like, well, what'd you think of Phuc's book? And my dad said, well, I didn't like it, but it's his story to tell, he can tell it his way, and I think incredible growth for my father, who 20 years ago probably wouldn't have said a sentence like that. So it's really powerful, that we're all changing and evolving, and, complicated people. And, I think I really wrote the book, I wrote it. My rule was if I was a firsthand witness, with the exception of one story in the book, if I was a firsthand witness to an event, I felt like I had the right to tell it from my perspective. And otherwise, if I wasn't, then I didn't tell the story. And I just felt like I felt like it was fair game. Like I made a list of, sort of all the things that I could remember. And then I thought about the things that were important, and events that were important or that shaped me, or that, for better or worse, were pivotal in my development, or obstacles to my development. So there is a lot of, sort of domestic violence and abuse in there, because you don't forget that as a kid. And it is developmentally important, important to me is who I am, like those things that I experienced. And I felt like it wouldn't be a true story, or my true story, if I left those out, if it were like bowdlerized or somehow sanitized. And that includes sort of like the sex, drugs, and rock and roll stuff too, right? Like it's like, I mean, ultimately, like my story is a pretty classic, like coming of age, like Bildungsroman kind of story. And it's like, what teenage boy growing up in the 80s, like didn't have that like sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing, I mean, it's not, hopefully it's not gratuitous, but I felt like if it weren't in there, if I took it out because I felt squeamish, it just wouldn't feel true, or I'm going to use the word authentic, to my story. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that idea of kind of being firsthand witness, because, you were there, you do have your perspective. And as we all know, like that doesn't necessarily match other people's, but I think that's a really interesting starting point with that rule of how do we tell and what do we tell? do you just have the most amazing memory on earth, or or were you journaling, or is some of this kind of reconstructive from what you remember, or some of these just such profound light bulb memories? Like, I can't imagine writing about some of my early childhood as clearly and evocatively as you did. So I'm really curious about your process in doing that.
Oh, thanks. It's I think I think the genre is technically called creative nonfiction. So I think what I would say is I would put my hand on a Bible and swear that all of the events, as bullet points happen, right? Like, for sure, God's honest truth. Did the dialogue is that dialogue, like, did that, was there a, transcription of it? Absolutely not. Like, I totally made up dialogue, and I think, like, that's the creative part of the creative nonfiction is, so here's a scene, here are sort of the bullet points, the plot points, as it were, for what happens in this scene. But how do I write dialogue or add description that deepens it, or that is evocative? And then how do I write dialogue that is true to the characters, meaning me, my parents, my brother, that's revelatory, but also moves things forward, or is just funny, or whatever, and that captures the true spirit of who those people are, my family. So that was really fun. Like, it was a fun project of taking real events and then, sort of finessing them and writing them in a way that you could sort of do like these like quick sketches of your family members and convey that to the reader in as short a space as possible.
Did you have to workshop those with anybody who also knew your family members? Like, does this sound like so and so?
Yeah. I mean, I think my wife is really like my first line reader. I mean, she knows my family very well. I mean, the good thing is that, my brother as a character is very young. And I sort of know my dad and my mom and my dad so well that it was really hard for me to actually not sort of write them as like almost like caricatures, that I had to like sort of write them as like real, fully complicated human beings. That was actually very much like the challenge, was to sit down. It was a powerful experience for me, really, was to think about this is so bizarre, is to think about my parents and writing them like real human beings. And in the process of writing about them like real human beings, my feelings for them, like my empathy, my sympathy, really like cracked open in a big way, only through the process of writing. Because I mean, I think it's so easy even as an adult to sort of fall back into the mechanisms of my childhood and just like be like, oh, my parents, like, they're grounding me again, or whatever. It's I mean, it's just, those ruts are very deep.
Absolutely. Well, and cycling back a little bit to what we talked about earlier with you're mentioning how as a child it can be very disconcerting to feel like your parents don't navigate the world the way that you would like them to, but it's really hard to see our parents as people, as actors who know how everything's going to play out as well as any of us do, which is not at all.
Right.
And,
yeah.
And even as adults, I mean, that's how we knew them for the most formative years of our life, is the people who, in theory, we thought should be able to manage everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if this is going to scar my kids in a completely different way, but like, I really want to like be fully transparent with them, and I want them to see my full humanity. I think, my parents, I really, had sort of like emotional walls up, like we never see my father cry, like my dad never said I love you, and there's like weird things like that, that I thought I still don't know if they're cultural. I think they are cultural, but they're also sort of idiosyncrasies of my father. So I think like my parents, that piece of like not seeing my parents as fully human was that my brother and I were never invited in to see that either. And I don't know if my parents were protecting us, because I mean, they experienced unspeakable, horrible things that they just probably didn't want to talk to us about because it wasn't appropriate. And so like, I think the flip side is like my wife and I are like really transparent with our daughters, and I'm sure they're going to talk to their therapists about it. They're going to be like, my dad talked about his vasectomy. Oh my God, or something like that. Who knows?
So right, at least it's new.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so we've got about 12 minutes. I just want to make sure we get through some of our questions in the Q&A. Sure. We touched base on some of these a little bit. So one of our viewers wants to let you know that your book is absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
And we talked about this a little bit, but whether you've been able to share these stories that are in your book with your family without making it too bleak, because a lot of them are very painful memories. Or is it kind of that they got the book and the conversations came after? Or how has that process been with your family?
So, sorry, as I shared the stories with my family,
yeah, the question directly was, have you been able to share them with your family?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, yeah, the book for sure. I mean, I'm not going to force anyone to read the book. I think anybody who's in my family who wants, I mean, and everybody who's in my family, like, knows, or at least the big family stories, like, everybody knows those stories, like when my, uncle, like, spoiler alert, it's like when my uncle, committed murder and then suicide, it's like, there isn't anyone who doesn't know that. But I think, so I write about that. And, I think it was maybe, I don't know who in my family really wanted to know what I was thinking about, this, that, or the other through high school. But I haven't heard from anyone who felt like I got things wrong. And my brother, who is the person that I thought he was the person I was most worried about reading, just because like he and I shared so many of the same experiences. Like my brother felt like I really captured both our family's dysfunction and the challenges of growing up in Carlisle in the 80s. So I think once my brother sort of like gave me the thumbs up, I was like, whew, okay. Like, I think, also my brother's a lawyer. So I was like, oh my God, is he going to sue me? If I get this really wrong, but he texted me, he's like, good job. I was like, all right. So I felt like, that felt really validating, to feel like I captured my experience as well as a little bit of his, even though his experience is going to be different from mine.
Absolutely. We've got another question in which someone mentions that the Carlisle Indian School featured significantly in another book that they've read, and if you had any interactions with the students from that school.
I have, and I'm so fascinated by it. I mean, I mentioned it just in passing in an early draft of my book, and I think that just sort of got edited out. And I want to say that, growing up in Carlisle, like, the Indian school was a source of great pride for the town. Like, it was like, oh, that's where Jim Thorpe, came from. And, I don't know if you know much about the school, Kathryn, but the motto for the founder of the school, for the Carlisle Industrial Indian School, was "Kill the Indian, save the man." I mean, it was like, it couldn't have been more genocidal. I recognize that now. Growing up in that town where, like, I'm just like, I don't know, guys, I'm just new here. You tell me what's going on. They're like, oh, Carlisle Indian School, we're so proud of it, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's the mascot on like a bajillion things in Carlisle. So it was a deep source of pride in my town. There's like a mural in the mall that's like dedicated to it. Like, it's very bizarre. And now, right now, I'm just like, this is not good. And I would love to have a conversation with, I've watched the documentary. There's a PBS documentary about the Carlisle Indian School that I've watched. And I mean, it's just in the last like 2 to 3 years, at least as far as I'm aware of, in the public conversation, that we're even having these conversations about the existence of these Indian schools and how sort of genocidal they were. Yeah, it's complicated. And I just felt like, also going back to it, like, kind of not my story to tell. Like, all I could say was I was there, and I didn't, I was told that it was like an awesome thing, and it really was not, like, not even close. But
But it has taken a long time for the conversation outside of Indigenous communities to really pick up on. This was not the best series of institutions that we created good on people.
Yeah, that's the understatement. That's the century. Yeah. I mean, I'm just curious, like, I mean, that you, like, I was always aware of it just because I grew up there, but it really, like, that conversation about it, like the reconciliation with it, or the sort of the truth telling about it, like, that feels newish to me anyway. I mean, I know, like, there's a lot of press coming from Canada too, right? About that, about the Indian schools up there too. I mean, I think it's just a reckoning that we've got to have, among many reckonings, right, about this country. But yeah.
Absolutely. We've also got a question, which you mentioned a little bit with talking about your parents, but did writing the memoir change your relationship with your past or your family members, or how you viewed some of those formative parts of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I think um I think that it really forced me to, both for the sake of the narrative, right? So that it wasn't just striking sort of like a single note or kind of a flat note. I was looking for sort of a rich, complex composition. And so like I really it leaned into that. And my parents were really supportive. Before they read the book, they didn't really know what the book was going to be, and I was kind of cagey about it, so I didn't talk to them. But they knew I was working on a memoir about growing up in Carlisle, and so my parents were really forthcoming about um, information. Like it wasn't a lot of like, this is how we felt. So if and I'm very careful to not talk about that. Like I can't sort of make conjectures about how my parents felt. They never told me. They still don't really tell me. Like, it's just like they don't talk about feelings. But all I can do is say, like, I witnessed this very difficult situation, and this is how my parents dealt with it. And I think like that's enough for readers to infer a lot, or at least to recognize that there's suffering going on and that people need help, or that people need community and things like that. I mean, that's like that's the first step towards recognizing anyone's humanity, right? Is just to recognize that they're going through something really difficult, and like, am I in a place to help them, or at least not harm them further? So I think, so I think, I mean, my relationship with my parents is better than it's ever been. Shout out to therapy, my therapy, not theirs. They will not go to therapy. But I think the book was just like another sort of piece of that sort of relationship building as an adult. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Then in our last few minutes, question I was hoping would get asked. What got you interested in tattooing, and what is the most memorable tattoo you've done?
Okay, yeah. So I mean, in high school, like all my punk rock friends were getting tattooed, and I just didn't have money because I was poor, so I never got tattooed. And then, but I was always very interested in tattoos, and I actually drew tattoos for my friends to go get tattooed on them in high school. And then in college, my parents gave me this like emergency credit card. It was like, really just for emergencies. And then I discovered that I had this cash advance function. I was like, what's this? I was like, this is like free money, And so I got like a cash advance of like $200 or something, which, in like 1993 is a lot of money, and went and got tattooed with that money. And then I started getting tattooed through like grad school. And then while I was getting tattooed, one day, this is at the end of grad school, the guy who was tattooing me just said, hey, we're looking for an apprentice. You seem to be into the lifestyle. Why don't you apply to be a tattooer? And I just was like, oh, like you can make a job. You can make a living like doing this. This is a job. So I just applied to be a tattoo apprentice, and I got it. And so I moved to New York City, and I taught Latin during the day, and then learned how to tattoo at night. And the weirdest tattoo I've ever done, but most memorable, gosh, that's so hard. I mean, I don't know if there's like I mean, like the sort of cheeky answer I like to give is, I did a really funny tattoo of a penis fighting a vagina. That's pretty funny on a bartender here in Portland. That's a good one. But I really, I think I really love I love the stories and the clients that come in along with the tattoos. Like I think that's like so deeply powerful, and I think it connects to who I am as a writer and a storyteller. Because I think first and foremost, like you have to be a good listener. So I think like in some ways, like being a tattooer is this like incredible gift to the front row seat of people experiencing the best things that have ever happened to them in their lives, and they're commemorating it with a tattoo, or the worst things that have ever happened to them, and they're commemorating them with a tattoo. So it's incredibly humbling. I don't forget that. And I hear all sorts of things, and it's pretty amazing. And I don't think I can ever write a book about it, because it's, again, not my story to tell, but it's so enriching to be there and to be in that space with people.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about at the top of the hour. So my last question that I ask everybody who comes is, what's next for you?
Oh gosh, yeah. So So I do. I've got. I wrote a children's book series by accident, sort of. So that's coming out in 2024, and 2025 and 2026. So there's 3 children's books coming out. And I wrote it. I didn't illustrate it. The illustrator is this guy named Pete Oswald. He did like the Underwear Dragon and the vegetables, the food group series, like Smart Cookie and Good Egg, and so A Bad Seed. Yeah, so Pete and his agent approached me and asked me if I wanted to collaborate with them on this story. So I wrote that, and so that's coming out on HarperCollins. And then I'm working on a novel. So that's, sort of in the early stages. Like, I'm taking notes. I've written some pages, but I'm not really sure where that's going to go. But it's really fun and so challenging in a very different way from writing a memoir. So those are the 2 sort of, and I still have my office job as a tattooer. So that's my day. That's my day job.
So now you're doing tattooing for your day job and writing at night.
Yeah.
Latin and tattooing in New York.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm teaching. My teaching is on hiatus right now, but it's just so that I am not like a complete sort of deadbeat dad. Like, I think I need to see my kids like once or twice a week, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Phuc. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Oh, thanks,
to all of our viewers, again, the memoir is Saigon. We have it here at the library if you would like to borrow it, or as always, if you'd like to support our fantastic author, we highly encourage you pick something up from bookshop.org or our kind of partner bookseller, Face in a Book, which you can find links on our website for all that. And yes, as always, keep an eye on our website for our next author event. And thank you again for joining us, Phuc. I hope you have a fantastic evening. Yeah,
thanks. Thanks so much, Kathryn. It was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Great. Have a good night, everybody.